Okay, so very much for that, Chris and John. I will just begin with the presentation from the London side of the team. As you guys know, we'll also hear from our colleagues in Germany and Milan. So I'm just going to begin with what we have found in London. So can everyone see that?
Yes.
So I'm going to leave it like that for the time being, if that's okay. All right, so our project comprised of, as heard from with John, Michal, and myself, background, a little bit on the background to the London part of the project, why we chose specifically kind of the Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets mainly. But there was a lot of discussion about what parts of the community to research, and it kind of I suppose it boiled down to kind of experience and our respective kind of interests as well. That all three of us kind of agreed to research. So John, if you want to just tell us a little bit about your background, and then I can go into a bit more depth, perhaps.
Okay, yeah. My first search was done in Calcutta. I got very interested in the partition of British India and interviewed over 100 Bengali Muslims who decided to stay in Calcutta rather than go to Pakistan, what was then East Pakistan. And then I got my job at Roehampton in 1973, so coming up to 50 years there. And I had the usual problem of continuing my research, and it was solved really because of the Bangladeshi settlement in the East End of London. So I did my PhD in the between 1980 and 1986, which is a very interesting time as the second generation people at Ansar were getting involved in the local political structure. And then I moved on to looking at issues around mosque building, with the East London mosque being built, a lot of controversy, Brick Lane Mosque following a different kind of policy. So I've been largely working on issues of migration, not just in Tower Hamlets, but also working with Michal, I mentioned before, on Polish migration. So the changing character of Britain's immigration features, and so that's me. I'll hand back now to Shamea.
Thanks for that. So I am the postdoctoral research assistant, and I've also been researching Bangladeshi communities in London for a long time. My PhD was on understanding a sense of belonging for second generation British Bangladeshi migrants, British Bangladeshi second generation Muslim young women, daughters of the first generation migrant parents, and how we kind of understand a sense of heritage and a sense of belonging. I have Bangladeshi heritage myself and can speak Bangladeshi. So that's my background in a nutshell. And we've also had real insight and real experience from Michal, who's also here, who's kind of given insight into translocal migration, as we've heard. So Michal, do you want to say a couple of words?
Thank you, Shamea. Thank you, John. Thank you for introducing me. I mean, I think there was a interesting research process, because research and conceptualization process, because at some stage with Joerg and Marco and Samuele, we were looking at various transnational dimensions of it, and there are, and you know, probably the feeling that the more you research, the more questions arise, the more avenues, empirical avenues open up. So I was, I mean, the majority of fieldwork was, of course, done by Shamea, and so I won't I won't pretend I know much about this, but I think the main point is that we were able to combine our ethnographic experience and anthropological insights into. I mean, the main point is what people do in face of institutions, rather than having an overtly and too much emphasis on institutional and structural frameworks. So I think this is what we were, I suppose, fairly strong at. So looking at what people do with these structures, and which obviously helps a lot in the context of understanding resilience, resistance, and individual capacity to deal with stuff that happens. Thank you.
All of these, I guess, this rich experience allowed us to kind of utilize an experience. We've already had connections with the East London and we brought our own experiences as well, and understanding communities and how this kind of shaped, as Michal and John have both said, and we kind of utilized the networks within both the Bangladeshi community and the East London end as well. So this was kind of the impetus for choosing how we did the research was we interviewed about 15 people from a wide range of backgrounds. Most of them, as John was saying, were done in English. Most of the interviews were done in English. Some were conducted in Bangla, which were then translated and transcribed accordingly, verbatim, and during the transcription process as well. We interviewed a variety of respondents. So we had people from all kind of backgrounds and all kind of experiences talking about their experiences through their lived experiences and ways of dealing with the COVID pandemic. So we had medical doctors, heads of charity organizations. There were community activists and campaigners you will meet towards the end of today. We had a funeral director, a couple of councillors, an imam from one of the mosques in East London. Someone called a COVID champion, which I will talk about a little bit later. 2 university students who were kind of who we met through a mosque, and we also interviewed. There's an influx of not an influx. There are a lot of Bangladeshi migrants coming from Italy now, who we had the privilege of meeting and interviewing. So we had a whole plethora of different kind of people from different backgrounds, which gave real insight and gave real richness to the project. So just some of the themes that arose particularly from the overall project that we've been discussing in both Milan and Stuttgart, but so some things are kind of quite specific to us as well, that kind of shapes hopefully what we'll work on as well in the future. So trust and risk was one of the important facets that we discovered whilst doing the research. There are a lot of respondents who were talking about the interface or the separation between politics and science, and how in London, especially when the politicians and the scientists came together, what that meant, and how there was a notion of distrust that was heightened within a lot of communities, but the Bangladeshi community especially. Who do we trust? Are they, because Bangladeshis, there are Bangladeshi politicians, councillors within Tower Hamlets, and how they were kind of understanding their own kind of notions of positionality as well, was an issue there. The notion of community, how the community and the networks that were already forged, or did they become they become a lot stronger, and they became a real support for each other during the pandemic. The notion of integration, as we found out, is very dependent upon the individual. It's not only upon the individual that that is important, but it's also how the host community welcomes the individual, and it's also very dependent upon the circumstances of that individual. We also found out that, you know, different when we were discussing Muslim identity, that it depends upon how long perhaps, and how integrated, whatever that term means, in terms of community cohesion, and how the length of time people are allowed to kind of integrate into the host country. The notion of technology, pertinent and quite important. There were a lot.
Shamea, I think we might have lost sound, unless it's just me.
No, it's not just you.
Could you just check your mic, Shamea? Can't quite hear you. Came in for a second, but we still can't hear you.
Okay.
Ah, yeah, you're
Can you
coming
hear me
back in
now?
now. Yeah,
Okay.
yep.
We've got 4 minutes left. Yeah.
We got 4 minutes now. Let me just whiz through very quickly.
Yeah.
The technology kind of, as I was saying, that it allowed us to understand things. It allowed us to stay in our homes but be connected to people at the same time. The notion of age as well, the youth and the elderly experienced the pandemic in very different ways, in different capacities, also related to the notion of who is allowed to, you know, who has a capacity to be online, etc. The government had a choice of whether, you know, the government allowed choice and freedom. They shaped people's behaviors in certain ways, perhaps through the lockdown and things that they allowed people to do or not do. And we also found that the religion, the mosques, were more of a communal space, and it's not just a place of worship, and it's not just a place of worship, but it was a space for which allowed people to find out about their others. The others. The notion of environment was very important, how emotion was played out within the pandemic by certain family members. You know, we had financial issues which came to the fore as well. And obviously there is an interface between life, death and emotion, which was very traumatic, and it was a very emotional time, as we all know. So we have some quotes very quickly, just to focus on trust and risk. We have 4 people for just which were very pertinent to some of the things that we've been speaking about right now. Zed talks about, I'm just going to give you a very brief outline. Zed talks about having a white politician who's communicating science. That's never happened before. And some of the, he talks about the scientists spoke about science, but you've got the politicians who talk about politics. They never had come together. But the scientists and the doctors, some are the most trusted professionals, and politicians are not necessarily. And that brought a lot of distrust in how people were experiencing the pandemic, and, you know, the affected vaccine uptake and things like that. A talks a lot about the skepticism of the government, which bring this forth a little bit further. There was distrust of the government, but people trusted scientists. But when there were disagreements between the scientists, between the scientists themselves, that created a lot more skepticism. And people obviously behaved contrarily, and that changed significantly when people came to hear that they were being barred from certain things that they had previous access to, as AB says. But it's also a notion of integration and how you fit within the community or the communities. But it also works both ways as to how Tower Hamlets, as I was saying earlier, receives the individual or not, or it depends upon how they feel in terms of integration. And the very last one, we were thinking about the system from a systems level, from a grander perspective, and we came across the three: the macro, the meso, and the micro, in a nutshell. And obviously the overarching deciders of the British government, the NHS and policymakers had a real influence upon how we were understanding the COVID situation. On the other side, we had the micro people or the ordinary people, in quotes, who experience the everyday life, people going shopping, people visiting their families, etc. But in the middle, how was the dialogue between the macro and the micro? Well, that was something that came that emerged from our project. And we found at the meso level, the Tower Hamlets had introduced something called COVID champions, who were kind of the go-between between the macro, the government and the NHS, and the micro level. So they were having this dialogue between the two levels. And this was really important to understand. And there was constant learning between these two levels. And so it included other activists as well, who are obviously intermediate, and there could be a scope for a lot of learning or future research. And the meso level proved really crucial for understanding people's needs and relaying information between levels. And I will stop there. So thanks very much for that.
Great, thanks, Shamea. Okay, so as we're running up against time, let's hand over straight away to Joerg over in Germany.
Well, thanks, John. But before I start my formal talk, I would like to thank Chris and John for setting up this marvelous event. And like Chris said, this is very important to collaborate also in this kind of discussion in order to then maybe move on and to turn our preliminary findings into something more written, which then is maybe of more lasting impact. But this kind of event you don't get very often, and this is why I'm really grateful also from the German side that you have organized this for us. Okay, I also am going to share my screen, and hopefully you should all see my PowerPoint now. And before I, like Shamea, go straight into the findings of our interviews, I would like to start with maybe 2 or 3 more general remarks towards research design and research setting, and then go more into the interviews in relation to questions of trust and of a particular type of trust in that respect. As you can see, we are working from a University of Applied Science basis, and this applied science in this case is public administration. And so our starting point still doesn't quite work. Let's see if it does it now. Yeah. So our starting point was much more inclined initially towards understanding state capacity and governance in times of crisis. So our starting point was indeed political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who said something interesting in relation to trust, because he said what you need, not only in times of crisis, but generally when you move from an old-fashioned state-centered approach to government to a more networked and governance-oriented understanding of state and state capacity, you need at least 3 layers of trust. The first one being a trust in the professionalism, the education, and the ways of bureaucratic dealing in administrative matters. You need trust in the reliability of public institutions, the frontline delivery of state capacity. Also, especially in times of crisis, this is severely challenged. And most importantly, I think, and this is what brings me then towards the actual issue of trust and cooperation, is a culture of trust in a culture of leadership, which is more than technically dealing with problems, but offering some kind of narrative and vision, especially again in times of crisis. And Fukuyama then goes on and says, well, all this doesn't amount to anything if it is not met by trust from the state side in the self-organizing capacity of civil society or society in general. And this was the reason actually why we said we need to look at it from both sides, from migrant communities and their migrant organizations, self-organizations, but also from the side of the state, and here in particular, local state and public administration. And if this works well together, well in quotation marks, then there might be something developing which Karin Schönwalder has called an urban culture of cooperation, which could be a good foundation for coming and getting through a crisis. So the idea was to consider the corona pandemic as a stress test for this kind of arrangement of mutual trust between frontline public administration at the local level and migrant community associations and organizations on the other side. Background here, I mean, I think it's quite obvious. On the one hand, there was a severe crisis of multi-level governance during the heydays of the pandemic, where the federal and regional governments virtually left the local governments on their own devices. And on the other hand, it was a crisis for migrants and migrant communities and their organizations, because obviously they felt under increasing pressure to prove their citizenship or denizenship status in terms of compliance and being part of a solidarity culture, if you like. So this is the tiny fragment from which we were working, and this is my second preliminary remark in terms of research setting and design. This is the DTIP mosque in Stuttgart-Feuerbach. On the left side, you see the actual building, a derelict industrial site, if you like. And on the right side, you see the envisioned future building. Supposedly, it was meant to be there already in 2025, but Corona has meant that it was put on standby and on hold. And so now they are planning for 2030. But you get a sense of mobilization power and a sense of aspiration, which drives this Turkish community in Stuttgart when you see how they envision their future in Stuttgart. So basically we did also 13 interviews, roughly divided between local borough council, Stuttgart-Feuerbach. This was our fragment in terms of forensic research. Not the whole of Stuttgart, but Stuttgart-Feuerbach, and then radiating out, if you like, by following the issues, following the networks. And on the side of the migrant associations, it was the Mosque Association in Stuttgart-Feuerbach, relating back to the picture you just saw. And in order to also get at another fragment of Turkish society in Stuttgart, we also focused on the German-Turkish Forum, which is a body dedicated towards education and art, geared towards the middle-class segment of Stuttgart society, if you like, attempting to bring Turkish high culture into Stuttgart society. So moving now straight into the interviews, our question was then, what kind of themes could we detect that maybe would allow us to say, okay, there is something like a trust environment which allows an urban culture of cooperation to evolve or to be sustained during a time of crisis. And the first theme, which was very clear in both sides, settings of interviews, LA always stands for local administration and MO always stands for migrant organizations. There was a prevalent discourse on saying we are all Stuttgarters. Now, we have called that localized universalism. And so the idea was we are all Stuttgarters in that sense, that we have the same problems. How do you get through the pandemic in terms of everyday life? How do you get your children educated? How do you not lose your job? How do you keep families intact? The migrant organization, surprisingly, and Chris has played on this in his introduction, kept line with this kind of discourse. They said the virus doesn't make a difference between migration background or not, despite all knowing the disparities which we have in terms of housing facilities, working in jobs that don't allow home office or working from home, and so forth and so on. So there was a surprising prevalence on both sides of this kind of localized universalism. The second aspect is this kind of urban culture of cooperation wouldn't work in terms of trust if there wasn't more than just this kind of official discourse of localized universalism. So on a practical side, I think they lived from, during the pandemic, they lived from a culture of short distance communication, which is both meant metaphorically and in reality, because the local borough council building and the mosque building are only 200 meters away. So if they want to discuss something, if they have a query or whatever, they would just go there and discuss things immediately. At the same time, you can sense from those quotes that it's also meant in a different way when we talk about a short distance culture of communication. What is meant here is that you need to approach the other side in a more personal way. Yeah, like either going there personally or writing a particularly nice email, which makes clear that this is not part of the ordinary bureaucratic structure, but you always take the extra step, make the extra effort in order to give some kind of Wertschätzung, I would call it in German, acknowledgement, yeah, acknowledgement of the other side and the effort they are doing on their side. The third dimension would be, even though they have been already socialized, if you like, into this kind of roundabout way of approaching each other, social brokers became especially important during the time of lockdown, yeah, when there were no official bodies that normally engage in the dialogue between local migrant community and local public service provider and local state, as for instance, the aforementioned German-Turkish Forum or the Forum for Interreligious Dialogue or the International Committee in Stuttgart. Those would be discussion bodies, organizing bodies that deal with interreligious dialogue, integration, migration on the whole of Stuttgart society, but not in particular Stuttgart-Feuerbach. So in a sense, they were trained already to approach each other in a kind of roundabout way or directly, like I said earlier on. So in times of lockdown, what became important here is that social brokers emerged which were not there before. So this could be, for instance, a pharmacist. Yeah? The pharmacies never closed, even during the first prolonged and severe shutdown in Germany. So in this case of Stuttgart-Feuerbach, the pharmacist was someone who would not be a member of any of those official bodies of engagement between state and migrant communities, but she in this case was very engaged in terms of a civil society pioneer in matters of integration and migration. And she was kind of brokering, yeah, the information and the opinion between local state representatives and migrant community. Another example would be a vicar of a Catholic church who turned out to be a charismatic figure in terms of connecting the different helping networks that emerged. So, and in terms of both sides, state representatives and migrant organization representatives hooked on to these social brokers in order to keep informed about the other side.
You've got about 6 more minutes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Shall manage. So what we see emerging, I think, is a pattern trust. And pattern trust, I'm not sure if that is perfectly correct in English, is meant to express something which is somehow between structure and a personal trust. Yeah, so we ask them, is it more person related, or is it a structure which you just fill in because of your role? And they all said, well, yeah, something like you can see here taken out from the interviews. There is a well-trodden path, but it's not a pure bureaucratic structure. It always needs the extra effort of those people who are involved in these structures. And interestingly enough, both the migrant organization representatives and the local administration representatives talk in a metaphorical way about heart. It's a matter of heart. It needs the extra commitment that makes this kind of trust towards each other survive this kind of severe crisis situation during the pandemic. So it's not the structure, it's not the individual, it is the individual filling these structures and making them work. In order to get not too romantic towards the end, they are at the same time perfectly clear on both sides that here we have a microphysics of power. And for the local administrative side, it is perfectly clear who sits in the driving seat and is the actual pilot and who is the co-pilot. On the other hand, and this is a quite interesting observation, there is some kind of cheeky, I would almost say cheeky attitude from the side of the migrant organizations who say, well, they might be sitting behind the steering wheel, but we have the actual map. Yeah? And so actually it's a co-driver who directs the future of integration policy in Stuttgart-Feuerbach. I skipped that one in terms of time because you all know that, yeah, vaccination initiatives, which then serve as a symbolic expression of this kind of urban culture of cooperation. We had that in London and we had that in Stuttgart, and both sides are claiming that for their purposes. Yeah? The state side argues, well, we have proven, yeah, that we have, if there's need, we have access to those communities and they are compliant. And the other side says, well, yeah, actually it's a drop in the bucket or a drop in the ocean, but we have symbolically proven that we are a reliable partner in this urban culture of cooperation. However, is that a good thing or not a good thing, if I may have 2 minutes for conclusion? Because I think here I would contradict Chris a little bit, yeah, because you talked about a deteriorating trust environment or low trust environment between migrant organizations and migrant communities and the state. I would say that at least in this fragment, which we have researched, we see a persistent culture of urban cooperation based on mutual trust that has kind of survived the pandemic quite well and even maybe developed some kind of resilience out of it. But the big question for us in Stuttgart then is that a good thing or a bad thing? In terms of old-fashioned understanding of resilience, I would say, yes, it has proven resilience because you go back to normal, yeah, where you started before the pandemic. But if a crisis is also a way forward in terms of reorganizing things, be more open about issues which have never been properly addressed, like disadvantages in housing, disadvantages in the education system, local voting rights for migrants who have not the German citizenship. Then, of course, this kind of grinding machine, I would call it, yeah, which has worked perfectly well during the pandemic, before the pandemic, during the pandemic and after, is not really the way forward. And this, I think, comes across quite nicely in the final concluding sequences from the interviews. The local administration representative is quite self-confident in this matter, yeah, and says, well, we have lived up to the expectations, the demands which have been placed on us via the corona pandemic, we have solved. Yeah, we have worked like a machine, if you like a bureaucratic machine, whereas the representatives on the other side, migrant organizations, are more disillusioned, I would call it, because they clearly see that they have helped to sustain a machinery which doesn't address the burning long-term issues. Yeah? And so the big question is, to what extent have we actually learned something in the pandemic? Because it seems like everything has worked in an almost normal way and we go back to normal. But this can't be the outcome of the corona pandemic and not the outcome for a post-corona society where we need maybe new outlooks and new solutions for old problems. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. We're making good time because we want to have some time for questions and feedback. So over to you, Marco.
Okay, thank you. I share my presentation. Okay, I would like to thank again John and our friend in London for organizing this important seminar, and all of you for joining this seminar. Well, so we in Milan studied the impact of the COVID on Peruvians living in Milan. So I like to start with a few notes about Peruvians in Milan. We have a bit under 70,000 Peruvian legally resident in the municipality of Milan, 30,000 if we consider the whole urban area. They are the fourth largest national group in the city after Filipinos, Egyptian, and Chinese. Among Peruvian citizens living in the urban area of Milan, those in irregular condition are about 11%. This is a really important group, and I'm going to show you why briefly. The majority of Peruvians in Milan are female, and the greatest number of Peruvians reached Italy and Milan in the first decade of this century. The Peruvian community in Milan has not a long history, is a relatively new settlement. Then Peruvians living in Milan appear to be distributed throughout the municipal territory without any evident form of ghettoization. In particular, there is not a Peruvian or Latin American neighborhood in Milan. There is no such neighborhood. And then Peruvian community in Milan is lively but fragmented. For instance, we count more than 20 Peruvian associations in the city, and these associations seldom cooperated with each other. And last point, religious belonging has a very important role for social life and identity of many Peruvians, and this was a special focus for part of our field work, and Samuele will present something about this special part of our research. Well, during our research, we completed 17 interviews, in particular one with one Italian officer of the municipality of Milan, the officer in charge for migration in Milan, then one with the responsible of the Archdiocese of Milan for migrants, 3 interviews with leaders of Peruvian associations, 6 interviews with non-expert Peruvian citizens or common people, just to say, and the last 6 with the Peruvians or Latin Americans involved in religious associations. And then some results about the impact of COVID. First point, the pandemic had different individual effects and made more evident inequalities already existent into the local society. And from this point of view, there was no differences between the experience of Peruvians in Milan and the experience of Italians. For Peruvians, the main discriminating variable was the condition of either regularity or irregularity with respect to their residence in the country. This is the most important point which emerged from our interviews. Well, for regular Peruvian citizens, the consequences of the pandemic have not been significantly different from those experienced by Italians. For instance, there were difficulties for people with kids attending online school, but this was relevant for Peruvians, but also for Italians. And only some Peruvians face some specific difficulties in accessing the aid available due to a reduced linguistic competence in Italian language. You must consider that Italian language is very similar to Spanish language. So for your common life, if you speak Spanish, you can easily understand Italian, and you can easily make yourself understood by Italians. And this is okay for everyday experience. But in order to manage paperwork, for instance, paperwork required in order to get helps, you require required a very high competence in the use of Italian language, and many Peruvians have not this high competence in Italian language, and so this was a problem for them. Then ethnic-based networks of acquaintance and friendship seem to have played an important role in the face of the informational chaos, which Italian citizens also complain about, and also an important role in helping people with difficulties with paperwork due to the low competence in the use of Italian language. Okay, but I must say that also Italian citizens had some problem with the very difficult Italian bureaucracy. But definitely more difficult has been the situation of irregular Peruvians, especially those who lost their also illegal jobs due to the COVID. In particular, irregular Peruvians had significant problem in get assistance, in particular in get medical assistance, and even to access the medical assistance which Italy guarantee also to irregular migrants. But in many cases, those people don't know about the services provided by Italy also to irregular migrants, or they be a bit afraid about their status of irregularity. So they were afraid to be noticed by police, for instance. And then last point, those most in need, not only regular migrants, benefit from informal help networks, sometimes but not exclusively on an ethnic and or religious basis. But I'd like to stress that a lot of people we interview told us that many Peruvians had not specific problems during the COVID, no more problem than those experienced by Italian. And then we had a special focus on the role of religions. And so I give the floor to Samuele for presenting this part of our research. Please, Samuele.
Okay. Thanks to Marco, John, and Chris for the workshop. So I moved to present some findings I collected during the research in Milan on Peruvians. In particular, the research has developed by considering 3 different religious sites where a significant part of Peruvians regularly gathers in the Milanese area. The first one is a Catholic chaplaincy. The second one is an evangelical church. And then we have a Pentecostal church. These are three case studies representative of Peruvians in terms of religiosity. And this special focus wanted to elaborate three main dimensions. The first one is to discover how religion is important in a critical period like the pandemic. We know that often people look for religion in a critical period, in a time of need. And the pandemic, I think, was important in this term. Then I wanted to explore, to research on the functions of religion in practical terms in this critical moment. Then I would like to discuss 2 points which can be useful to understand the relationship between state, religion, and immigrants. So the question is what we can learn in terms of social implications in a time like the pandemic. So we can move, and I would like to show you 3 photos which represent our case study. So Marco, you can skip the slide, please.
I try, but there is a problem. Sorry, Samuele.
Yes, I would
just okay, Justin.
Show you.
I have some problem with my keyboard. Sorry, Samuele. Okay. Okay.
So sorry. This is the Catholic community we considered. This is an Italian church which was closed in the past, and then Peruvians in the city reopened the church in the last 15 years. Then we have the second case, and this is an evangelical community. So as you can see, this is a factory, but externally is a factory, but internally we have an evangelical church. Maybe you can see a poster in the photo which explains the presence of a church within a factory. Then we have the Pentecostal reality. As you can see, this is a warehouse. Externally is a warehouse, but internally there is a Pentecostal Peruvian church. So now I would like to explain the role of these 3 different realities in terms of welfare. And these are the 3 M's modality. The first one is the mutualism. So this is the case of Catholicism. So solidarity develops through what I call the religious social capital. You know, relation become resources. This is particular important. This was particularly important during the pandemic. So the internal networking has become an important resource for immigrants in terms of food parcels, financial support, fundraisings, collections, counseling, and all the form of helps immigrants need in a time of pandemic. Then for the Pentecostal and evangelical reality, the welfare took the shape of a mission. So solidarity moved beyond the social capital. So the welfare activism was a sort of mission. So help the brother and the sister in need. This is also a way to attract new believers within the churches. Then we know that these are immigrant churches, so they are in a certain sense limited in terms of resources. And in the case of Catholics, the church was important in terms of hub, in terms of in terms of becoming a sort of hub with the Italian churches. For Pentecostals and evangelicals, the important question is that they are typical independent, autonomous realities. But during the pandemic, the question was to work in network. So independent churches try to create interconfessional networks through which enlarge the types of resources during the pandemic. Then I would like to stress another point of our research, and this was the role of women within these three different realities. Because the gender side, the gender perspective was important during the research, because most of the leaders were women. And I think this is a point to stress, because these women created in their community a new form of protagonism, a new form of activism. These are women who are normally family caregivers, cleaning ladies, what we call in Italy badanti. But at the same time, they created through this welfare activism a new image, a new form of protagonism they don't have in the secular sphere. Then their role was really important in terms to avoid, enemy and chaos. So this welfare activism was important to keep the situation quiet. So in giving support, in giving intercultural mediation, they help the believers of these churches. And I think this is important because this can be interpreted in terms of citizenship, but not in political terms, but in ethical terms. So they wanted to present a good image. They want to present them in respectable terms. They want to present a good image against a bad external image, against the discrimination discourses on immigrants in Italy. This is their way to fight against discrimination. So our communities are important, have a key role, and this is particularly true in a critical moment of our history. So then I move to conclude, and we have two different types of conclusion. The first one is that, so I presented the welfare activism, but at the same time, the pandemic posed key questions in terms of integration. Why? Because, this is a sort of paradox, because we considered in our research the community of Peruvians. This is a community in Italy we commonly think integrated, so they have settled during the last 3 decades. And we think they are well integrated, well established in our society. But at the same time, the pandemic show us that the integration is not a definitive conquer, is not so robust, but it's something precarious. Then another point is that social mobility in Italy is another challenge for immigrants. In studying, in elaborating on the welfare activism, I show you that these are women who are family caregivers, cleaning ladies, badanti, and so on. At the same time, they look in the last decade for a better position in our economy. But this is a challenge. And so we face the issue of a glass ceiling reality. And so this is a challenge in Italy and in this moment. Why this is important? Because the pandemic was a sort of meditative moment for immigrants. So they started to think, okay, what is our position in society? So our future, our living conditions. So the pandemic was a sort of window on themselves. I mean, then finally, I would like to conclude by discussing the role of religions. This is a quite critical topic in Italy. I have only 2-3 minutes, but I would like to stress this point because so formally, you know, freedom of worship is something guaranteed by the Italian constitution, but at the same time, the legal juridical infrastructure poses significant limits for the practice of religion, because it is an individual right, but there are numerous different limits for creating a community. As you have seen in the photos, in particular for Pentecostal and Evangelicals, these are communities established in factory, warehouse. These are liminal spaces, so they are not formally a religious community. So they are a community, but the state doesn't recognize their presence. At the same time, these liminal spaces were pivotal during the pandemic. And so they did what the state did not for immigrants. And this is a sort of Italian paradox in the relation between religion and state. Finally, I think that the welfare activism I show you can also be interpreted like a strategy to create maybe, I don't know, the basis for a stronger acknowledgement for religions in Italy. So maybe the communities move to reinforce their role in terms of welfare, in terms of support, because they want to challenge this Italian paradox. So in terms of relationship between state and religion. So the welfare activists were pivotal. At the same time, I think we can discuss the same activism in terms of strategy. The immigrants, in strategy, the immigrants followed to create a stronger recognition for their religious belonging. So this is my conclusion, and thanks to all.
Thank you very much, Samuele, and thank you all the contributors. So we do have some time for questions, so I hand over to Chris to lead that.
Thanks, John. So I'm just gonna, I think I said I'd stop recording for this bit. So I'm just gonna stop that, and that'll enable us to